I was 60, wealthy and heartbroken when I met Ethan, a 22-year-old surf instructor who looked like a god. He made me feel alive, wanted, and worthy of love again. But what started as a dream turned into a nightmare. I gave him my heart. He wanted my money. And just as I uncovered his betrayal, the ocean claimed him, leave him broken and lifeless. What happened next would change both of our lives forever. The first thing I noticed when I stepped off the plane was the scent of salt in the air, carried on a breeze so warm it felt like an embrace. The island was a dream, its golden beaches stretched endlessly, framed by turquoise waters and swaying palm trees. This was the escape I needed. A place to lose myself and forget the years I'd wasted in a marriage that had turned cold long before the divorce papers were signed. At 60, I had money, freedom, and nothing to lose. My villa was perched on a cliff overlooking the ocean, an extravagant retreat I had booked on a whim. As I walked out onto the terrace, the view took my breath away. Below, the waves rolled in a hypnotic rhythm, and a few surfers danced on the water, their movements graceful and effortless. I envied their freedom, their connection to the sea. That was when I saw him. He stood at the shoreline, the sun glinting off his bronzed skin. His blonde hair clung to his face, dripping from the ocean. Even from a distance, I could see the strength in his broad shoulders, the sharp cut of his jaw. He exuded a confidence that made it impossible to look away. And then, as if sensing my gaze, he turned. Our eyes met. He smiled, a slow, easy grin that seemed to light up the entire beach. My heart, long dormant, skipped a beat. I didn't expect to see him again, but fate had other plans. The next morning, I wandered down to the small surf shop near my villa, curious about the local scene. The moment I stepped inside, there he was, folding towels behind the counter. He looked up and grinned like he'd been expecting me. "Hey," he said, his voice warm and inviting. "You're staying at the villa up the hill, right?" Caught off guard, I nodded. "Yes, I am. It's stunning here." He laughed, a sound as smooth as the waves. "It's paradise, isn't it? I'm Ethan, by the way." "James," I replied, shaking his hand. His grip was firm, his touch lingering just a second longer than necessary. "You ever tried surfing, James?" he asked, leaning casually against the counter. I laughed, shaking my head. "I'm not exactly the athletic type." "Nonsense," he said, his blue eyes sparkling with mischief. "It's never too late to start. Let me teach you." I should have said no. I should have laughed it off and walked away. But something about him, the way he looked at me, the way he carried himself, made it impossible to refuse. "All right," I said, surprising even myself. "Let's give it a shot." The next morning, Ethan met me on the beach with a surfboard under one arm and that same charming smile. He was patient, guiding me through the basics with an ease that made me feel less self-conscious about my awkward attempts. Every time I stumbled or fell, he was there, pulling me up with a laugh and a reassuring hand on my back. For the first time in years, I felt alive. Not just alive. Seen? After the lesson, we sat on the sand, watching the sun sink into the horizon. Ethan told me about his life, how he'd grown up on the island, his love for surfing, his dream of traveling the world. There was a wistfulness in his voice that tugged at something deep inside me. "You're lucky," I said. "You have the ocean, this beautiful life." He shrugged, a shadow crossing his face. "It's not as perfect as it looks. The island's expensive, and surfing doesn't exactly pay the bills. But hey, you make do, right?" I didn't respond, but I couldn't shake the sadness in his tone. As the days turned into weeks, Ethan and I grew closer. Surfing lessons became dinners on the beach, long walks under the stars, and quiet moments where words weren't necessary. He had a way of making me forget the years between us, making me feel like I was the only person who mattered. And then, one evening, as we sat on the terrace of my villa, the unthinkable happened. Ethan leaned in, his lips brushing against mine. It was tentative at first, almost shy, but when I didn't pull away, he deepened the kiss. I had never felt anything like it. Passion, connection, and the thrill of something forbidden all at once. "James," he murmured, pulling back just enough to look into my eyes. "You're different. You make me feel alive." I didn't know what to say. All I knew was that I didn't want this moment to end. For the first time in decades, I let myself believe in the possibility of love. The days with Ethan felt like a dream I never wanted to wake up from. Every morning we met on the beach, the golden sunlight dancing on the waves as he taught me how to master the art of surfing, or at least attempt to. I was clumsy, my balance more suited for boardrooms than surfboards. But Ethan was endlessly patient. His hands, firm and warm, guided me into position, his laugh softening every wipeout. "You're getting better," he teased one morning as I tumbled into the shallow water for the fourth time. "Soon, you'll be the one teaching me." "Unlikely," I said, coughing up seawater, but his grin made the failure worth it. The ocean was his world, and I felt privileged to be a part of it. But it wasn't just the water that pulled me closer to him, it was the way he made me feel alive. Ethan wasn't just beautiful, he was magnetic, with a carefree energy that was impossible to resist. After our lessons, we'd spend hours lounging in the shade of the cabana, the salty breeze carrying our conversations. Ethan spoke about his dreams with a passion that was infectious, his desire to travel, to explore the world beyond the island that had been both his home and his prison. "You've probably seen it all," he said, lying back on the sand with his arms behind his head. "Not quite," I admitted, staring out at the horizon. "I've seen success, sure, but the kind of freedom you have, that's something I never gave myself." He turned to me, his blue eyes filled with curiosity. "Maybe you're freer now than you realize." His words struck a chord, though I didn't fully understand why. Ethan began spending more time at the villa. Evenings turned into nights as he stayed for dinner, then drinks, then long conversations under the stars. He had a way of making the world disappear, his attention so focused it felt as though nothing else existed. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and pink, Ethan surprised me. "James," he said softly, his voice almost hesitant, "you've been so generous to me. I don't think I've ever met anyone like you." "It's nothing," I replied, brushing it off. "I enjoy it." "No," he insisted, leaning closer. "You've made me feel seen, like I matter." The vulnerability in his voice caught me off guard. Without thinking, I reached out and placed my hand on his. "You do matter," I said, my voice steady, but my heart racing. He smiled, his fingers brushing against mine in a way that sent a jolt through my chest. That night, we kissed for the first time, and every doubt I had melted away. Over the next few days, I found myself wanting to do more for him. A new surfboard to replace his battered one. A designer watch he admired during one of our walks through the market. Ethan protested at first, but his resistance quickly gave way to gratitude.
"You don't have to spoil me," he said one afternoon, holding up the surfboard with a grin. "But I'm not going to lie, it's pretty awesome." I laughed, brushing it off as nothing. The truth was, I wanted to spoil him. For the first time in years, I felt like I was giving to someone who truly appreciated me. Not just for my money, but for who I was. Or at least, that's what I wanted to believe.
As perfect as it seemed, small cracks began to show. Ethan's phone was always buzzing with messages, his tone changing when he answered. He'd disappear for hours without much explanation, returning with a charming smile that made it hard to press him. Then, one evening, as we sat on the terrace sipping wine, he dropped a casual question that sent a ripple of unease through me. Have you ever thought about investing in anything outside your usual portfolio? Something exciting, like a new venture or property? I hesitated, surprised by the sudden shift in topic. Not really. Why do you ask? He shrugged, playing it off. Just curious. You seem like the kind of guy who could make big things happen. His words were flattering, but something about the way he said them didn't sit right. Still, I pushed the thought aside. Later that night, as Ethan showered, his phone buzzed on the counter. Curiosity got the better of me, and I glanced at the screen. A message from someone named Jake flashed. How much longer? We're running out of time. My stomach dropped. Something was wrong. Terribly wrong. I froze, staring at the glowing screen. The words were like a punch to the gut. How much longer? What did that mean? My mind raced, but before I could piece it together, I heard the water shut off. Panicking, I placed the phone back on the counter and moved to the terrace, trying to calm my breathing. When Ethan walked out of the bathroom, his hair damp and a towel slung low on his hips, his smile was as disarming as ever. You okay? He asked, noticing my silence. Yeah, I lied, forcing a smile. Just tired. Long day. He nodded, leaning in to kiss my forehead before heading to the kitchen to grab a drink. But as he moved around the villa, I couldn't shake the sinking feeling that everything we'd built was about to come crashing down. Over the next few days, I started paying closer attention. Ethan's phone was constantly buzzing, and his mood shifted when he thought I wasn't looking. He'd excuse himself to take calls, returning with vague explanations about friends or errands. The man who once felt so genuine now seemed like a stranger. One evening, while he was out, I made the decision to go through his phone. It wasn't something I'd ever done before, but I needed answers. What I found made my blood run cold. Messages between Ethan and Jake painted a damning picture. Jake, keep playing nice. The old guy's loaded. Ethan, he's hooked. I'll get what we need soon. Jake, don't screw this up. We need that cash. The words blurred as my vision clouded with disbelief and anger. Every kiss, every touch, every whispered promise. It had all been a lie. When Ethan returned that night, I was waiting for him in the living room. He walked in with his usual carefree grin, but it faltered the moment he saw my expression. What's wrong? He asked, setting down his keys. I held up his phone. Care to explain this? His face paled, but he quickly tried to recover. James, it's not what you think. Don't lie to me, I snapped, my voice louder than I intended. You were using me. All of this, everything, was just some elaborate game to get my money. For a moment, he said nothing, his jaw tightening. Then, with a sigh, he dropped the act. Fine, he said coldly. You're right. I needed the money, but don't act like you didn't get anything out of this. You're an old man, James. You wanted someone young and exciting, and I gave you that. His words cut deeper than I thought possible. Get out, I said, my voice trembling. Now. Ethan hesitated, but the look on my face must have told him I wasn't bluffing. Without another word, he grabbed his things and left. That night, a storm rolled in, the wind howling and waves crashing violently against the shore. I couldn't sleep, my mind replaying every moment with Ethan and the betrayal that had shattered it all. Around midnight, I heard shouting from the beach. Curious and uneasy, I stepped onto the terrace. What I saw made my heart stop. Ethan, drunk and angry, was heading into the ocean with his surfboard despite the treacherous waves. "Ethan!" I shouted, but he either didn't hear me or didn't care. I watched helplessly as he paddled out, the storm's fury swallowing him whole. For a moment, he disappeared behind a massive wave, and then I saw him thrown into the air before crashing against the rocks. Without thinking, I ran to the beach. By the time I got there, the lifeguards had already pulled him from the water. His body was limp, blood trickling from a gash on his forehead. "He's alive, but barely," one of them said, their voices urgent as they loaded him onto a stretcher. Hours later, I sat in the sterile hospital waiting room, my hands trembling as I replayed the scene in my head. Despite everything, I couldn't bring myself to leave. When the doctor finally emerged, their expression was grim. "He's in a coma," they said. "The head trauma was severe. It's hard to say if or when he'll wake up." The words hit me like a tidal wave. Ethan, for all his lies and betrayal, was still someone I had cared for deeply. And now, he was hanging by a thread. As I stared at him through the glass of the ICU, pale and lifeless, a part of me wanted to walk away and leave him to his fate. But another part, the one that had fallen in love with him despite everything, couldn't. I had to make a choice. Stay and face the pain of what we'd shared, or leave and never look back. I didn't know if Ethan would ever wake up, but one thing was certain. Nothing between us would ever be the same. The rhythmic beeping of the machines in Ethan's hospital room filled the silence. I sat in the chair beside his bed, staring at the man who had turned my life upside down. His face, now pale and bruised, was a far cry from the sun-kissed perfection I had fallen for. The bandage wrapped around his head was a stark reminder of how quickly things had spiraled out of control. I wanted to hate him. Every fiber of my being told me to leave and never look back, but I couldn't. Despite the lies, despite the betrayal, a part of me still cared deeply for him. Maybe it was foolish, but I couldn't abandon him now, not when he had no one else. I reached out, my hand trembling as I touched his. His skin was cold, his fingers limp. "Ethan," I whispered, my voice cracking. "Why did you do this? Why couldn't it be real?" The room offered no answers, only the faint hum of the machines. Over the next few days, I stayed by Ethan's side. The nurses began to recognize me, their sympathetic smiles both comforting and unbearable. I wasn't sure why I stayed. Maybe it was guilt. Maybe it was hope. Or maybe I was clinging to the illusion of the man I thought he was. One afternoon, as I sat in the hospital cafeteria with a cup of untouched coffee, I heard a voice behind me. "You're here for Ethan, right?" I turned to see a man around Ethan's age, his expression wary. "Jake," he introduced himself, sitting across from me without invitation. The name hit me like a brick. The man from the messages. I shouldn't be talking to you, he said, his voice low. But I didn't think this would go this far. Ethan's not a bad guy, okay? He's just desperate. Desperate enough to manipulate me? I asked bitterly. Jake sighed, running a hand through his messy hair. He didn't want to do it, but he's been drowning in debt. The surf shop, his rent, medical bills for his mom. He didn't know what else to do. You were an opportunity. His words stung, but they also painted a picture of a man trapped by circumstances I hadn't known about. He didn't deserve what happened to him, Jake added, standing. And neither did you. I just thought you should know. As he walked away, I stared into my coffee, conflicted. Ethan's betrayal had been calculated, but was it born from malice or desperation? Days turned into weeks. Ethan remained in a coma, his body unmoving, but his presence filled the room like a ghost. I talked to him, hoping he could hear me. I read the messages, I admitted one evening, my voice heavy with emotion. I know what you were doing, but I also know why. Jake told me everything. I paused, my chest tightening. You hurt me, Ethan, but I can't ignore the fact that I fell for you. I saw the good in you, even if you didn't see it yourself. My days became a cycle of waiting and wondering. Would he wake up? And if he did, would I be able to forgive him or even face him? It happened 2 weeks later. I was sitting by his bed reading aloud from a book I had brought when I noticed his hand twitch. At first I thought I imagined it, but then his eyelids fluttered. Ethan, I said, leaning forward. A low groan escaped his lips, and his eyes opened slowly. They were unfocused, his gaze darting around the room before landing on me. James, he croaked, his voice barely audible. Relief washed over me, but it was quickly replaced by a flood of emotions. Anger, hurt, confusion, and, inexplicably, love. You're awake, I said, my voice shaking. You're going to be okay. He blinked, his brows furrowing as if trying to piece together what had happened. What happened? He asked weakly. You had an accident, I said simply. You've been in a coma for weeks. His face twisted with pain, both physical and emotional. I'm sorry, he murmured, tears pooling in his eyes. For everything. For lying to you. For hurting you. I didn't mean to... Stop, I interrupted, my voice firm, but not unkind. You need to focus on getting better. We'll deal with everything else later. As I sat there, holding his hand, I realized the road ahead would be anything but simple. Ethan's betrayal had left scars, but his awakening opened the door to something I hadn't expected, a chance at redemption. Could I forgive him? Could he forgive himself? And more importantly, could we rebuild something real from the ashes of our broken trust? Only time would tell. Ethan's recovery was slow, and with every passing day, the weight of our unspoken past loomed larger. He avoided eye contact whenever I was near, his once confident demeanor replaced by guilt and uncertainty. You should hate me, he said one afternoon, his voice barely above a whisper. I don't hate you, I replied, but I don't know if I can trust you either. The words hung in the air, sharp and painful. Ethan surprised me during one of his therapy sessions. I want to pay you back, he said, his voice steady. Every penny. His determination was genuine, but I knew it wasn't about the money. It was about proving he could be better. It's not about repayment, Ethan, I said. It's about honesty. If you want to fix this, start there. Weeks turned into months. Ethan slowly regained his strength and with it, his confidence. He started working at the surf shop again, insisting on rebuilding his life from the ground up. One evening, he stood at my door, holding a small, weathered surfboard. "It's not much," he said, his eyes soft, "but I thought you might like a real lesson this time." We returned to the beach, the waves rolling gently under the setting sun. Ethan guided me once again, his hands steady, his words kind. "I'm not the same person I was," he admitted, his voice vulnerable. "Neither am I replied, stepping onto the board. For the first time in months, I stood on the surfboard, the ocean carrying me forward. Ethan cheered from the water, his laughter filling the air. As I glided toward the shore, I realized something. Forgiveness wasn't a destination. It was a journey. And for the first time, I was ready to take it. Ethan and I weren't perfect, and maybe we never would be. But as we sat together on the sand, watching the sunrise paint the sky, I felt something I hadn't in years. Hope. Sometimes love is messy. Sometimes it's painful. But every once in a while, it's worth the risk. Hey, what did you think of today's story? We'd love to hear your honest opinion. Your feedback is so important to us, so take a moment to share your thoughts in the comments below. And while you're at it, give this story a rating from 1 to 10. How much do you think this story truly deserves? If you've got a personal story or an idea you'd like to share with us, write it down in the comments too. Who knows? Your story might be featured here on our channel someday. Thanks for watching, and we can't wait to read what you have to say.